Hello, my name is Richard Albert. Welcome to the latest edition in our video interview series here at iConnect. And today I'm speaking with Joshua Braver, a doctoral candidate in the Yale Political Science Department. Josh's dissertation is on radical constitution making in South America, but today we're going to be talking about the UK, specifically why the UK experiment with judicial review has struggled to maintain its legitimacy, at least according to Josh. Josh, hi, thanks so much.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
So Josh, your forthcoming paper, which I have here and I've enjoyed reading and in fact exchanging ideas with you about it, is called Exporting Counter-Interpretation, Redeeming the US Constitution in the United Kingdom and Abroad. Although I think you have a revised title, isn't that correct? Redeeming Constitutional Supremacy in the US and the UK. So Josh, what's your paper about?
So the paper is an attempt to diagnose and offer solutions to what I see as an impasse, a struggle, a crisis concerning judicial review in the UK. And the central concept I use to do that is constitutional supremacy. So we often think of constitutional supremacy as an undemocratic concept. It empowers unelected and unaccountable judges to strike down statutes of the legislature. And this understanding has had a pervasive influence on recent constitutional design in a variety of Commonwealth countries, including the United Kingdom, where when a judge now declares that a statute is incompatible with a list of rights contained in the Human Rights Act, it actually has no effect on the validity of the statute. Instead, Parliament has to choose to go ahead and repeal it. And the idea behind this design was to preserve the very important, the cornerstone concept of the English constitutional system, parliamentary sovereignty. And this was supposed to balance individual rights and the democracy of the legislature. But I argue that this has actually been very problematic, that the system is in crisis, that the system isn't working, and that many of the goals that the system was trying to achieve have been, to some extent, reached in the United States. And I argue that the difference, the reason why the US has greatly succeeded and the UK has failed to achieve this exact same aim of empowering a dialogue between legislatures and courts about the meaning of constitutional rights, is the idea of constitutional supremacy. Instead of parliamentary supremacy, constitutional supremacy. And I worked through this thesis by exploring how coalition government in the UK briefly gave the Human Rights Act a kind of de facto constitutional supremacy. And during this period of de facto constitutional supremacy, the Conservative Party that had so vociferously denounced and condemned the Human Rights Act actually began to interpret it, to use it, and in that way validate it.
You used the word dialogue a moment ago, and I think this is the heart of what your paper is about. You say your paper's thesis concerns this idea of discourse. Could you say a bit more about that?
So dialogue is one of these concepts that's used all of the time, but it's a little bit often, not always, under-theorized. Because dialogue is just the exchanging of reasons between two people, and that can work in productive ways and in really unproductive ways as well. So to simplify a bit, in my paper, building on Jeremy Waldron's work, I say that there are three different models of dialogue that between a legislature and a court, three different models. The first one I call rights misgivings. This is a kind of majoritarian concept. The legislature says, I'm elected, I have majority vote, and therefore I can violate rights. I assert a right to violate rights. This concept actually, though it's sometimes talked about in the United Kingdom, not under that name, but this is a way that we interpret some of the debates that go on, is actually very rare. We live in a liberal era, an era of rights. No politician wants to stand up and assert that he's going to violate your human rights or your constitutional rights. What actually happens in the UK is something that I call general rights disagreement. So both court and the parliament believe that they are standing up for rights, but they disagree about which rights are valid, right? So you can think about it that maybe one set of actors believes that the United States values of freedom, right, are the most important values, whereas someone else believes it's the German concept of dignity, right? And as borne out in the UK, and as I'll talk about, general rights disagreement is inherently unproductive and unstable. It's unproductive because the two actors are talking past each other. There's not enough common baseline of agreement for them to have a healthy discussion and dialogue. And it's also unstable because the set of rights that the other person is using, they're constantly trying to repeal it or destroy it. So there's a third there's a third form of dialogue, what I call counterinterpretation. And here I'm drawing on kind of the US work in departmentalism and popular constitutionalism. And in this one, everyone agrees on the same set of rights, but they disagree over its meaning, right? And rights misgiving and general rights disagreement, the legislature felt entitled to violate a set of constitutional rights that the judiciary embraced. But in counterinterpretation, the legislature is not disagreeing with the value of its right, but its meaning. The legislature asserts its own independent right to interpret it differently than the judiciary. So in the United States, we have a long history of this. You really can't understand US history without understanding popular constitutionalism or departmentalism. And to me, this seems to be the only logical way, and was actually the goal of many of the people who designed the UK Human Rights Act. But they missed that constitutional supremacy was important to achieve this concept.
So we have these three models of dialogue between legislatures and courts. And so how do those map onto the UK system that you're studying?
So just to give some brief background, in the United Kingdom, in 1998, they passed the Human Rights Act. This act has kind of an intermediate status because it was meant to preserve parliamentary sovereignty. So on the one hand, unlike a normal statute, subsequent statutes don't automatically repeal it, right? You need to explicitly repeal it. And unlike ordinary statutes, the judiciary under Section 4 has a right to declare a statute incompatible with the Human Rights Act. And then Parliament can choose whether or not to do it. There's also Section 3. So your question was, I suppose, how has this worked out in the UK? And the problem is that because the UK Parliament has a right to disagree with any ruling of the judiciary based on saying that they don't like the Human Rights Act, right? That they have the option of repealing it. This has worked out not very well. So there are two ways to directly answer your question that it's been, I think, a real problem. The first is that the Human Rights Act has lost a great deal of legitimacy. I think a great deal of people are just indifferent or don't even know about it. The Labour Party really only could tepidly defend it, if at all. And the Conservative Party's a huge part of its platform is designed to try and repeal it, to scrap the Human Rights Act. And so this has become a big issue among the right-wing newspapers who denounce the Human Rights Act as a pervert and a terrorist charter. They call it the world's worst law. The Telegraph newspaper for a while had a campaign called End the Human Rights Farce. They say that it gave prisoners the right to pornography, that you weren't able to publish pictures of fugitives. And for both the 2010 elections and for the upcoming 2015 elections, the Conservative Party has campaigned to, as I said before, scrap the Human Rights Act. So that's the first problem. It's lost all legitimacy. The second problem is that Parliament has refused to counterinterpret. If the design of the Human Rights Act was to create a dialogue between the judiciary and the legislature about the meaning of constitutional rights, it hasn't happened. Either Parliament speaks in a different language, they speak in the language of English civil liberties, right? They call HRA rights alien, socialist, foreign to the system, even though there's no reason to really believe that. Or sometimes when they just parrot judicial interpretation of these rights. So there's a whole committees within Parliament, the Joint Committee of Human Rights, which is doing a better job now, but for most of its history, just repeated judicial interpretation of rights, even though their entire job was to kind of do something new. So there's room for reasonable disagreement, as I think you alluded to in the introduction, but I think in my opinion and from my vantage point, the Human Rights Act is in pretty big trouble. I think anytime an entire political party, one of the two major political parties, is campaigning to repeal a set of rights, then I think we have an issue.
Now you're entering a conversation in which there are many actors. So Mark Tushnet doesn't occupy the field, but is a very prominent presence in the field. Janet Hibbert, Alison Young. So these scholars have written on this and these related questions. How does your view differ from what they offer?
So, in terms of a diagnosis of the problem, or at least the fact that I think, if I think we all agree that there's a problem with the Human Rights Act. I think we all agree that the way it should work, ideally, is that it creates a dialogue between the legislature and the judiciary about the same set of rights. I think they're all on board for the idea of counterinterpretation. But I think where we disagree is diagnosing why this problem is happening, and therefore what the corresponding solution is. So just briefly, for Tushnet, the flaw is structural. You're just going to end up having kind of judicial overreach or legislative overreach. It's a little more complicated than that, but it basically means that there's no solution. This is just an inevitable problem with the system. Janet Hebert also focuses on structural problems. She talks about disciplined political parties and government dominance over parliament. I don't see either one of these changing anytime soon. And then the other idea, which is worth talking about in terms of Janet Hebert and many others, is that she thinks it's a problem with the political legal culture, right? And this is an idea of education. And other people, too, think that if the general public only understood what the Human Rights Act was really about, then they would change their mind. Then they would fight back against the Conservative Party. But I think this has a problem of degenerating into a kind of proclamation that your opponents are just not principled, that they're just distorters. It lulls us into believing that they're merely misinformed. And it's convenient because I think it removes the burden of searching for problems that require controversial institutional change. So, I'm sorry. So for me, the problem, and I think I offer a solution that's more likely, even if it is still difficult, the problem is that in a rhetorical battle over the meaning of a constitutional right, the odds are always stacked against the legislature, right? The legislature's attention is divided over a wide variety of issues. They lack the same legal expertise. And everyone, I think, in most countries trust their judiciaries much more than their legislatures, which seem to always have very low approval ratings. And we tend to think, too, it's just the structure of the way we understand the division of labor that law belongs to courts because they are principled, whereas legislatures are institutions of compromise, of corruption, of deal-making, horse trading, pork barreling, log rolling. So the incentives are structured so that legislatures will decline to counterinterpret. And if they have an option, they'll go to the safer ground, which they do in the United Kingdom, which the Conservative Party does, which is just to claim to repeal the Human Rights Act, because that's within their allocation of responsibilities. But if you introduce constitutional supremacy, that changes the calculus of costs and benefits. So symbolically, a supremacy clause like Article 7 in the US Constitution or Section 82 in the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms makes clear that the Constitution is the supreme law of the land. It's the only game in town if you want to argue against what the judiciary is doing. And then even more importantly, I think, is entrenchment against majority repeal. Conservatives might be less inclined to try and campaign against the Human Rights Act if it was very difficult to repeal. It might not seem like a realistic goal. So I guess I would say that constitutional supremacy is the way to go.
Yeah. Although I guess one related question is, I understand that there is this campaign to repeal the UK Human Rights Act, but what about claims that it has, since its enactment, achieved quasi-constitutional status, such that a simple repeal is just not quite possible? And this, of course, brings us into conversation with William Eskridge and John Farragon and their theory of a super statute.
I mean, I don't think it has achieved. I mean, it's a quasi-constitutional statute in the sense that its status is above that of an ordinary statute. But because everyone except for a select group of judges still believes in parliamentary sovereignty, because that was the original system that the entire Human Rights Act was designed to protect, and because it's so incredibly unpopular among a very passionate part of the public, I cannot believe that that if the conservatives went ahead and tried to repeal the Human Rights Act, that judges would stop them. Now, I should say that what they're going to do is try and install it with a new British Bill of Rights. But all the proposals for a British Bill of Rights still keep in the idea of parliamentary sovereignty that I've seen. And so I think you're going to run into a very similar set of problems that you had before.
And so you're proposing a quite radical solution, aren't you not, for the UK, which is to basically give up on this idea of parliamentary sovereignty?
I think the idea is already dying. The question is just who's going to control the inheritance and the bequest. Because at the moment there's the Human Rights Act, which already puts the idea of parliamentary sovereignty into some question. Some people think more so than others. There's also the European Communities Act, which is kind of a big assault on parliamentary sovereignty. So I don't think the concept is going to survive, at least in its current form. What you have now is a series of judges and theorists, T.S. Allen is one of the big ones, who are trying to come up with an idea of judicial supremacy, saying that the idea of parliamentary sovereignty is a common law idea anyway, and that judges therefore can chuck it at will. And I think this is wrong historically, but beyond that is not going to be very convincing. If you want to come up with a solution that is going to convince the legislature, then I think the initial impulse behind the Human Rights Act was right. It's just sharing responsibility over the meaning of constitutional rights, but just mechanisms by which it was realized were flawed.
Now, you have mined a recent subject of controversy in the UK, specifically the right to family life. You've mined that example as a way of illustrating your thesis. So how does that illustrate your thesis? Tell us about the example that you highlighted.
So the reason why this example is interesting is it's a moment where the Human Rights Act kind of achieved temporarily de facto constitutional supremacy. And during that period, as long as it lasted, the Conservative Party started to counterinterpret, and then when that de facto constitutional supremacy faded, so too did counterinterpretation. So just taking a step back, perhaps the most controversial issue, so in 2010, let's just take another step back. In 2010, the Conservatives campaigned to repeal the Human Rights Act. That election produced a hung parliament. No party had won sufficient seats to form a majority. The Conservatives came in first and formed a coalition with the third place winners, the Liberal Democrats. And these Liberal Democrats, I mean, it's an odd marriage because the Liberal Democrats have sworn to protect the Human Rights Act. So under the terms of the coalition agreement, the Conservatives promised to respect the Human Rights Act. And so electoral politics had produced a kind of de facto constitutional supremacy. Legally, the Human Rights Act was still a glorified statute, but politically, it had become supreme law. So I look at this in the issue of immigration and the right to family life, which is perhaps the issue that enrages conservatives the most. In these cases, an illegal immigrant has committed a horrible crime and is subject to deportation. Courts halt the deportation because the immigrant has established roots and ties in the UK, usually marriage and children, and therefore deportation would violate the right to family life. So right-wing newspapers publish stories about murderers and rapists who can't be deported. Theresa May, who's the Home Secretary, claimed that she couldn't deport an individual because of his family connection to a cat. So conservatives faced a quandary now that they were in this coalition because these decisions were going to keep coming. And the quandary was how to denounce the decisions on the right to family life, the judiciary's decisions, without breaking the coalition agreement. How do you fight back against the judiciary while still supporting the Human Rights Act? And the answer was counterinterpretation. So on June 19th, 2012, the Home Secretary of the Tory Party, of the Conservative Party, Theresa May, introduced before Parliament new executive rules about how she would handle deportation cases. These rules were meant to ensure a stricter deportation policy, but most importantly, May claimed that the rules deserved deference from the judiciary because they engaged in counterinterpretation. She claimed that the reason why the judiciary had been interpreting Article 8, the right to family life, incorrectly was that Parliament had never spoken up on the issue. And now Parliament would offer up its own interpretation of Article 8, one in which the right to family life had to be balanced against the prevention of crime or the UK's economic well-being. So prominent conservative MPs who had long opposed the Human Rights Act stood up and echoed the Home Secretary's counterinterpretation. The very same individuals who had pledged to repeal the Human Rights Act now interpreted it, now seem to validate it. What ended up happening was the UK Upper Tribunal struck down the executive rules. It argued that it owed deference only to statutes that passed both houses of Parliament, and the Home Secretary immediately condemned this judgment, but her response again engaged in counterinterpretation. She said again that the judiciary was just misunderstanding what Article 8, the right to family life, actually meant. And then she reintroduced the measure as a statute, which has now actually passed Parliament not too long ago. So strong case of de facto constitutional supremacy and counterinterpretation, but it didn't last because the coalition agreement began to unravel. So the conservatives and the liberals started squabbling over a variety of issues, such as Lords reforms and reforms to the electoral boundaries. There was a special election, an election in just one district, in which UKIP, a very conservative party, nearly won the election. Conservatives felt like they had to return to their grassroots. They had to again condemn the Human Rights Act, and again proposals started coming forth about repealing it. So
this is a great example for your thesis. A great example.
I think yes, I agree. I thought it was amazing and fascinating.
Josh, let me ask you. One of the benefits, I think, of comparative inquiry is that it allows us to learn about ourselves, about our home model, our home jurisdiction. Has your study of the UK model helped you learn anything about the US model?
Yeah, I think it has. So the UK and the US are similar in so many respects. Of course, we have a common language in history, but we also have, I think, a common tradition of not letting the judiciary have the last word, of being very concerned about this issue. And so in terms of those who are understanding, so I guess there's two things I've learned. One, those who are interested in understanding whether popular constitutionalism or departmentalism is actually something that really exists in the US, or whether it's just a matter of academic theorizing, to really look to the UK and see really what it would look like if we didn't have legislatures that thought in the language of the Constitution, and what a difference it really makes. The second thing, as a comparativist, the U.S. Constitution, which used to hold such a hallowed place in our field, really no longer is the model for new constitutions. I was struck, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, when she was speaking in Egypt during the height of the Arab Spring, told the Egyptians that she would not look to the United States Constitution if she was making a constitution in the year 2012. And there are a lot of good reasons for that. But one of the things that I think is special and unique about the US is our relationship between law and politics. That really the two are blending into each other, so that the Constitution, the meaning of the fundamental document that defines both the organization of our judiciary and the identity of the American polity, is not something whose meaning is decided by the judiciary, but is in fact always in contestation with the United States. So I think that was kind of an interesting thing that the United States still has to offer the world as an example to be studied.
And what is the influence of the codification of the United States' constitutional rules in this master text constitution? The UK, of course, has a constitution. So does the US, but they're differently situated. Does writtenness factor into your thesis at all, or your thinking as you compare the two models?
It's not writtenness, right? Because of course the UK Constitution is written in many different places. What's important is that one, it's codified in one place, right? Not among a bunch of disparate statutes, and that the status of that codification is that it's supreme, that it's the only language in which we can contest about individual rights. And I think the language is very fluid, very elastic. It can't be bent completely out of shape, but there's no real reason why the UK Human Rights Act, from my perspective, can't do the same work. It's not alien. It's not socialist. It was written by English lawyers, mostly under the direction of Winston Churchill. The rights are not particularly outrageous. So, yeah.
Yeah. So in the United States, the final court of appeal is the Supreme Court. In the UK, it's a different kind of a structure. There is a new Supreme Court, but there's also the European Court of Human Rights. How does this complicate your analysis of the question?
It complicates it a great deal. It's something that I really wrestle with because the European, so of course there's the UK Supreme Court, and then as you said, there's the European Court of Human Rights, and so Parliament would really be fighting against both of them. But what I would say in my defense is that Parliament right now, when it fights against the European Court of Human Rights, does do it in a sense of it has the problems between Parliament and the UK Supreme. So let me say two things. My apologies. First, I just want to say about my example, it's a set of rights that only are in contestation between the UK Supreme Court and Parliament. It's a case where really it has nothing to do with the European Court of Human Rights in any meaningful way, unlike other cases with prisoner rights. But insofar as we are interested in creating a healthier relationship between Parliament and the European Court of Human Rights, it seems like the same applies as it does between the UK Parliament and the UK judiciary. You need a common set of rights, a common language which you can discuss the problems in, because right now, from the perspective of the rest of Europe and from the European Court, the UK Parliament is just refusing to engage in the common discussion of rights that's flowering all about Europe. It makes it seem like they're just hostile to the very idea of rights when nothing farther could be from the truth. And so if Parliament wants to have a real opportunity to reason with and have a meaningful and productive dialogue with the European Convention of Human Rights, where they might actually listen to them, then I think some set of constitutional supremacy, some sort of embrace of the same set of rights is the way to go.
Josh, I want to ask you just a couple more questions, but first, just as it occurs to me, this is a very interesting paper, fascinating paper comparing the US and the UK. I would love to read a paper written by you comparing Canada and the United States, and maybe as well a bit of the UK and New Zealand mixed in as well. This is a great field for further study. I know it's not your principal field, but your insights are just so fascinating to me. A couple more questions, Josh, if I could. You don't mean to suggest, do you, that the United States has it all figured out, that the system here is operating as you would design it to operate, do you?
Certainly not. I think that one of the problems in the United States is that even though I wouldn't say we have a system of judicial supremacy, the judiciary still has a great deal of power. So lots of people talk about how much the U.S. Congress can fight back against the judiciary, it can kind of wiggle around the rulings, but at the end of the day, the judiciary, the U.S. Supreme Court's rulings can really forever damage a statute. I mean, we can only imagine what would have happened if the Sebelius case had gone differently. What would have happened to Obamacare? You know, that was a power that the judiciary really had in this country, right? We have other examples of flag burning, which was an issue where Congress repeatedly pushed back up against the court, and the court stood its ground and won. The Religious Freedom Restoration Act, another case where I think Congress had really reasoned through and had a good faith disagreement with the judiciary about the meaning of freedom of religion in the United States. And the judiciary refused to listen to it and really shut it down, a decision that many U.S. constitutional scholars across the political spectrum really were upset about. And so I think that the ideal system that I'd like to see is one that combines the best of both the United States and the UK. So it would have the spirit of the United States, where you have popular constitutionalism, where you have a rich and lively, energetic debate about the meaning of a common set of constitutional rights. But it would take from the United Kingdom's insight, and from, in fact, Canada's insight, New Zealand's insight, that perhaps that after this debate has been had, that the legislature should have the final word. So you need a judiciary to inspire debate, to prompt debate, to push the legislature to really deliberate about the issues at hand. But after they've done that good faith deliberation, after it's become a discussion in the public sphere and the public and the legislature have agreed that this is the best meaning of a constitutional right, at that point it should be the final, not the final word on what the law is, but also the final word on what the meaning of that right is.
Well, I look forward, Josh, as I say, please write that paper comparing Canada, the U.S., the U.K., and New Zealand. I think it's a great paper to be written, and you could certainly write it, and I'd be very interested in reading that. Just a final question, Josh. So you are based in the U.S. I assume you were raised in the U.S., but yet you have your tentacles in all parts of the world. You're writing your dissertation on South American constitutionalism. This paper now is demonstrating your expertise in the UK. You know a bit about Canada. How do you get interested in these comparative dimensions of constitutional law?
I think, like a lot of comparativists, I had questions about the United States that I couldn't answer or really understand without looking abroad. So for popular constitutionalism in the United States, for a better model of judicial review in the United States, I had to see what it was like elsewhere. To even understand whether there was anything really special about the relationship between law and politics, I had to look at Germany and see its system where a constitutional court is, I think, much more powerful than in the United States. In terms of South America, I was interested in popular constitution making, and what is the meaning of a revolution? How do a people make a constitution? Is the U.S. Constitution an example of a political and social revolution, or only an example of the former? And is that a remarkable achievement in and of itself? And without looking to see South America's, I think, much more radical tradition of constitution making, I couldn't really answer those questions. But then I found, in a way that can be problematic sometimes, that I started feeling like I had insights to share because of looking at both countries, for the countries themselves that I was studying, for maybe the way that the next time, someone like Hugo Chavez goes ahead and tries to make a constitution on behalf of the people in a social revolution, maybe ways that it can be done better, that maybe the next time, which may be coming up very soon, that the UK Parliament thinks about designing the system or reforming and amending the system of judicial review, that it could avoid the problems that have happened before. And I think it's because of my U.S. background that I'm able to contribute to that conversation in a meaningful way.
Well, thank you, Josh, and I'm looking forward to hearing your presentation in April when you will discuss your research into South America. Josh, thanks so much for taking the time today to talk about your paper. I'll get the revised title correct this time: Exporting Counter-Interpretation, Redeeming Constitutional Supremacy in the U.S. and the UK. Josh, thanks so much.
Thank you so much. It's really been an honor.
Bye-bye.